Well, after the happy subject of death and dying, we're on to another happy subject of the death penalty. But I want to start out, I want you to imagine yourself on a jury, as the opening of the text suggests. Imagine yourself on a jury in a capital case. And let's assume that there's no doubt about the guilt of the defendant and that the crime that's been committed meets the standard of the law that's applicable in your state for the death penalty to be considered. In my home state of California, juries also decide the sentencing part. So let's assume that we're in the sentencing phase of a capital case where you have convicted the defendant of first-degree murder, and we'll say, just to make it really clear and uncontroversial, that the entire event was captured on surveillance cameras. And you've used facial recognition software that you know exactly who the defendant is, and there's just no doubt about the guilt of the defendant. Okay? I want you to think about how you would vote on the jury, given your own biblical and theological convictions about the death penalty. So what I would encourage you to do is to stop the video right here and think a little bit about how you might vote if you're a juror in this capital case. If you want to talk to a friend about that, kick that around with somebody else, that would be a great idea for you to think a little harder about how you would vote in a jury scenario like that. What I hope to do with this session is to clarify what some of the issues are with regard to this issue of capital punishment. This, I think, in the Christian community, this probably is the most hotly debated of all the topics that we'll deal with. There's huge debate about the morality of the death penalty, whether it's consistent with biblical teaching. I regularly have students in my classes who come from other parts of the world, and there is a wide spectrum of opinion on the death penalty. I have students from Africa, for example, who've told me that the community is the group that administers the death penalty in their particular village. There's no government, there's no jury trial. They just administer it themselves. I have other students from Europe who are just aghast that there's anybody in the Christian community that thinks that the death penalty is a moral option. So there's a wide variety of views on this within the Christian community, not to mention and they reflect that of the public at large. So there's huge debate on this. The Bible actually has a lot to say about the death penalty, but very little of it is directly applicable to today, because most of what the Bible has to say about the death penalty occurs in Old Testament law. And we are not under the Old Testament civil law today. We are in a different era of the way God deals with His people. And so it's true that all of Scripture is relevant for us, but the Mosaic Law in that area is not directly addressed to the community of God's people today. So sorting out exactly what the Bible teaches on this and how it's relevant for today is, I think, the trickiest issue in sorting out our position on the death penalty. So let's think a little bit about some of the biblical teaching on this. The one place where the Bible first speaks to this in the book of Genesis is in Genesis 9 in verses 5 and 6. If you have a Bible with you, turn to that. And let's look at the first place where the death penalty is discussed in the Scripture in Genesis 9. It says, beginning in verse 5, it says, "And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind." Right? Now, that's the first reference to that, and it's grounded in the theological notion of human beings being made in the image of God. Now, that exact connection is a little tricky to make, but most people acknowledge that the reason for the life for life principle that comes out of Genesis 9:6 is because of the inherent dignity that human beings have by virtue of being made in the image of God, the inestimable value that human beings have require the ultimate penalty for the taking of life. So what Genesis 9:6 suggests is that when somebody takes the life, and the law clarifies this to ensure that it's first degree and premeditated as opposed to accidental, when someone premeditatively takes the life of another innocent human being, the ultimate price is to be paid in order to make the ultimate deterrent for that. Old Testament law expands on this considerably. In fact, in Old Testament law, there are a wide variety of things for which the death penalty was prescribed. There are certain sexual offenses. It's prescribed for idolatry, in addition to being prescribed for first-degree murder. Now, the law does clarify that for things like accidental death, things that we would call manslaughter or crimes of passion, for those that are, particularly those that are accidental, the law set up what are known as cities of refuge, in which someone could take refuge and be spared from the principle of life for life being applied. Now, of course, in Old Testament law, there's none of Old Testament law is directly addressed to the church today. We are not under the law. Therefore, we have to think about how the general principles of the law are relevant to today. But the specific standards of the Old Testament civil law that were applied to Israel as a nation do not apply to nations today, since there is no such thing today as one nation under God as a theocracy. Regardless of what it says on our coins and in our Constitution, we are not a theocracy in the same way that Old Testament Israel was, where the law of God was automatically the law of the land. So theocracy and democracy are two quite different things. Theocracy is what existed under Old Testament law and is no longer applicable today. The New Testament speaks a little bit about the death penalty, not very much, and there may be a couple different reasons for that. One, it may be because the Old Testament was so clear on it that in the New Testament there wasn't a need to clarify that any further. There's probably a sociological reason for that too, because in first century Israel, under the rule of the Roman Empire, one of the conditions for peace under Roman rule was that the Jews in the first century were not authorized to execute the death penalty at all. That was a Roman prerogative, not a Jewish one. So since the Jews did not have any ability to prescribe the death penalty, it was sort of a moot point to them. And there's understandably, I think, no real need for the New Testament to be addressing that. There are a few places where both proponents and opponents of the death penalty have invoked the biblical teaching. For example, in John chapter 8, opponents of the death penalty have put it like this. In John chapter 8, there's the account about the woman caught in adultery. This is in the beginning. It actually starts in 7:53 and goes through chapter 8, verse 11. You should know, too, about this particular episode in the life of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. There's a huge textual debate over whether this was part of the original text of the Bible or not. My own view is that it probably was, but it's hard to be sure about that, and there's a lot of debate about that. And in general, I'd be very careful about basing a theological position on a biblical text that has considerable debate about whether that was in the original text or not. But let's assume for the moment that it was in the original text. Opponents of the death penalty will argue from this that Jesus was faced here with a woman who, under the law, had committed a capital crime. Adultery was a capital crime under the Mosaic law. And this woman had obviously been guilty of that. And Jesus refused to authorize the death penalty, which suggests for opponents of the death penalty, Jesus was actually setting it aside and prescribing a new rule based on grace and mercy. Now, of course, part of the consideration for the woman caught in adultery is that it was an obvious setup. It was a setup in order to trap Jesus into making a statement that the religious leaders could use against him. The reason we know it's a trap is because the man who was involved in the adulterous affair was nowhere brought to justice himself. And so I think it's pretty clear that this was a setup designed to trap Jesus. And so his commentary was more on the process of the religious leaders trying to trap him than it was any statement about the death penalty per se. The second place where opponents of the death penalty argue against it is from Jesus' account in the Sermon on the Mount, where when it comes beginning in verse 38, so you heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. And then down in verse 43, so you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Right? What the argument that's often made is that the death penalty is inconsistent with how Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount that we are to love our enemies and to be forgiving toward those who wrong us. Now, in response, I would suggest that the Sermon on the Mount does not relate to the obligations of the state in protecting its citizens, because if that were true, then there would be no place for criminal justice, and everyone, regardless of the crime they'd committed, would have the option open for them not to be resisted and to be forgiven for it. And everyone would walk if that were applied to criminal justice. Rather, what the Bible outlines for criminal justice is in Romans 13. And there's a very short statement that has to do with the death penalty in Romans 13. But the broader context is one of criminal justice in general. This beginning in verse 1, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist in the state have been established by God. And then down in verse 3, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what's right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Okay? The part of what God has ordained the state to do is the exercise of criminal justice so that the society over which the state rules could be safe and secure, and that crime would be punished proportionate to the offense that's been committed. So as part of the state's role in maintaining order and providing for justice, God has ordained the state to be the instrument of criminal justice. Now, what does that say about the death penalty? Well, there's one phrase in Romans 13:4 that proponents of the death penalty argues for it. And that's the phrase in verse 4. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. That phrase, bearing the sword, is often cited as a support for something like the death penalty, because the sword there is taken as a figure of speech for at the least criminal punishment in general. But the likelihood, the proponents argue, is that the sword was used not as an instrument to beat someone or to inflict other types of punishment. The sword was actually used as an implement of death. And therefore, the figure of speech, when it says they don't bear the sword in vain, or as the NIV puts it, rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. The bearing the sword notion suggests that the sword is used as an implement of death, which would also include the death penalty as a part of under the general umbrella of criminal justice in general. So my assessment of Romans 13 is that the original readers probably understood the sword as an implement of death, but basing a theological position on a figure of speech like that would cause me to hold my conclusion on this a little bit more tentatively. So what the Bible seems to suggest is that Genesis 9:6 does allow for a life-for-life arrangement when innocent life is taken. But the New Testament evidence on this, in my view, is a little sparse, and it's not clear to me that you can draw really solid dogmatic conclusions about the death penalty simply from the biblical teaching. Okay? Now, one other part of Scripture that addresses this, and you'll see this on the next slide, comes from a very interesting part of the Mosaic Law in Numbers 35:30, where it seems to sort of appear out of nowhere, and it puts down one of the conditions for the death penalty to be accomplished under the Mosaic Law. Now, this is preceded by a section on the cities of refuge, which, in cases, as I mentioned before, in cases of accidental death, allowed a safe haven for someone to go to be free from any family members who might avenge the death of their loved one. And Numbers 35:30 puts a really important condition on the death penalty under the Mosaic Law. And it says this: anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of witnesses. And what they mean by that is eyewitnesses. But no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. And this is strengthened by the fact that perjury in a capital case on the part of these witnesses was also a capital crime for understandable reasons. Because if you perjured yourself in a murder case that caused an innocent person to be put to death, that's almost as good as you putting the person to death yourself. And so that was also a capital crime under the Mosaic Law. Now, what that suggests is that it took two eyewitnesses, corroborating eyewitness testimony, in order for a death penalty to go forward under the Mosaic Law. Now, of course, we're not under that strict standard today, though some have applied that. Some proponents of the death penalty actually have put that as a condition for it being applied today, and which I think for the most part would have most people on death row, their sentence would be commuted to a life sentence almost immediately, because there are very few cases of capital murder that have two eyewitnesses available to provide testimony. But there are other ways today to provide the kind of certainty of guilt. That's the reason there were two eyewitnesses necessary, was to be absolutely sure that the person who was condemned was actually guilty of the crime. Today we have, I think, other ways to ensure the certainty of guilt besides two eyewitnesses. In fact, I think you can make a good argument that some of the ways we have today, such as DNA evidence, might actually be more reliable than eyewitnesses whose memory is not always perfect when it comes to those details. So the application of this today, I think, is the general principle that stays with us, is that the absolute certainty of guilt has to be in place before the death penalty can even be considered on the table for discussion. Now, let's think about some of the arguments in favor of the death penalty, in addition to some of the things that the Bible teaches, which I think, in my view, I think you have to hold the biblical teaching on this a little bit tentatively, because the New Testament is so sparse on this. But the general arguments in favor of the death penalty include a demand for justice, that there is something about the life-for-life requirement that is fair and just. And I think, for example, if we took the case of the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building and was responsible for 150 or so innocent people, a lot of women and children being killed. I think that the argument there is if he got a life term, a lot of people would conclude that there's something not quite right with that picture. That somebody who committed that heinous a crime has somehow forfeited their right to life. A second argument in favor of the death penalty has to do with the idea of deterrence, that the stronger the penalty, the more deterrent value it has. That is, the more capable it is of providing a very powerful incentive for people not to commit those crimes. And in general, I think the idea of deterrence is correct, that intuitively, the stronger the penalty, the greater a person's fear of running afoul of the law and incurring that penalty. But the problem with the application to the death penalty is there's no way to know what exactly the deterrent effect of the death penalty would be, because there are so many different factors that enter into the murder rate in a specific community or a specific state. And there's too many factors involved in isolating the deterrent value of the death penalty is almost impossible to do, given the other factors that contribute to the incidence of violent crime in a particular community. The third argument is that the cost of a life term is something that society should not have to pay. And there's another argument for this, that it's not only the cost, but it's the unfairness of society providing room, board, and medical care for a condemned murderer throughout their lifetime, when the victim no longer enjoys any of the benefits of continuing to be alive. So I'd say it's not so much the cost of a life term, but it's the unfairness of a life term, which relates back to the argument from justice. And then a fourth argument is that capital punishment does not constitute something that's cruel and unusual. That's been confirmed by the Supreme Court as far back as the 1970s. And there's no reason why proponents of the death penalty would say that we can't have the same kind of procedure for the death penalty that we do for euthanasia today. There's no reason that a mercy killing, even of a convicted murderer, has to be cruel and unusual. Right? Now, on the other side of the coin, there's some pretty significant arguments against the death penalty. One is in principle more, and then the rest are what I would call procedural concerns. One is that it gives a double message about the sanctity of life. It says that not everybody's life is sacred. And it's just, in essence, it's government saying, do what we say, not what we do. That if all of human life is sacred, then the death penalty ought to be off the table. A second argument is that mistakes not only are made, but they're inevitable, given the fact that we have fallible human beings involved in the deliberations about guilt and the deliberations about the penalty phase. And in fact, several states in the last decade or so, since the advent of DNA evidence, have seen numerous death row defendants exonerated because of the additional evidence that DNA evidence can provide, work to exonerate people who've been on death row for as many as 20 to 25 years. That seems to be a significant issue. I don't think there's any doubt that in the past, innocent people have been mistakenly put to death. A third argument against the death penalty is putting someone to death precludes reform, and from a Christian worldview, precludes an opportunity at redemption. And if we really care about all people coming to faith, we should put the death penalty off the table to give maximum opportunity for someone to hear the gospel and to come to faith. A fourth has to do with the cost of these lengthy appeals. In my home state of California, the average time a person spends on death row is roughly 20 years. And during that time, there are all sorts of expensive appeals that are being filed. And it may be that the cost of that is offset by the cost of a life term. But in any case, the cost of those appeals could be foregone if we just sentence people to a life term without the possibility of parole. And then a final argument against the death penalty is that it's discriminatory in its application. That even taking into account the incidence of violent crime, the death penalty is disproportionately given to minority men. White women are hardly ever given the death penalty, despite the case of Karla Faye Tucker, which is a sidebar in the text that I hope you get a chance to read. She's one who genuinely came to faith, but did not ask for her death sentence to be commuted, because she saw that her coming to faith did not offset the consequences for her actions that had taken place in the past. But given the discriminatory way in which the death penalty is applied, opponents of the death penalty have argued that it just reflects a very imperfect judicial system, and the unfairness of the way in which the death penalty is distributed suggests that it ought to be off the table until we can fix the discriminatory components that taint our judicial system. So there's good arguments on both sides of this. The things that I find the most compelling are the biblical notion of the idea of life for life not being intrinsically unfair, but yet the argument against the death penalty that mistakes are inevitably made, I find to be a very compelling piece. The question I would have given this notion that mistakes are inevitable in the process is what is gained by the death penalty that would offset the losses that would come that will happen when mistakes are being made. I'm not convinced that we lose all that much by sentencing people to a life term without the possibility of parole, because at the least, if it turns out that a mistake was made, we can release someone from prison, we can compensate them for the time that they've spent in prison unjustly, but we can't raise the dead. And that is, I think, a very compelling point. So there's going to be lots of ongoing debate and discussion on this. My sense is that we would hold whatever conclusions we take on the death penalty a bit tentatively, given that the way in which the New Testament just speaks so sparingly to this, and the fact that mistakes are inevitable because we have human beings involved in the process.